Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's Bridge Lunch Break event about Michigan's industrial legacy. My name is Jacqueline Garrett, Fund Development Associate here at Bridge, Michigan, your source for nonprofit, nonpartisan news in Michigan. In this hour, we'll discuss Bridge's recent reporting project on Michigan's complicated industrial legacy and how lawmakers and automakers are to reckon with factory pollution and business incentives in the transition to electric vehicles. Today, Bridge, Michigan business reporter and associate editor Paula Gardner and our environment reporter Kelly House will discuss this in-depth collaborative reporting project, which analyzed the economic and environmental impacts of the state's manufacturing past and present. Amber DeLinde, our membership and engagement director, will moderate today's discussion. You can read full bios of our panelists on the event page, and we'll drop a link to that in the chat as well. Our conversation will begin in just a moment, and Amber will lead that discussion with Paula and Kelly for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll turn to your questions. Please type any questions you have for our panelists today into the chat window at any time. And if you're not a panelist, please remain muted throughout today's discussion. We are recording today's conversation and it will be posted on Bridge, Michigan this week. You can subscribe to our daily Business Watch and Environment Watch newsletters by visiting www.bridgemi.com and click subscribe. Events like this one are made possible by the support of Bridge members. If you'd like to join this membership community, we will drop a link to do so in the chat. Reminder again, please stay muted throughout the conversation. Events like today's Bridge Lunch Break are made possible by the support of readers like you. Become a Bridge Club member, please. I will now pass it over to Amber to get this event started.
Thanks so much, Jackie, and thank you to all of the Bridge readers who are joining us today for our discussion of Michigan's industrial legacy. We're delighted to see so many of you, especially because I know that the package of stories was released just this week. So there was a lot of really great reporting that was done by my colleagues, Paula and Kelly, and I'm so excited to get a chance to talk with them about what they found and sort of what might come next in Michigan and what will happen with Michigan's industrial legacy. So thank you all for being here today. I'm going to get us started with a question that's really for both Kelly and Paula, and I'm sure they'll each sort of tell us a little bit about it. First things first, what were the major findings of your reporting on the automobile industry's pollution legacy in Michigan?
Paula, shall I start and then we can kind of flesh out together?
Yes.
I think if we were to describe it in one sentence, which we did, I think in several of the stories, it's that Michigan and its automotive industry are forging toward the EV future at this critical moment in time, but it's happening in many cases without a lot of accountability to the communities that are part of the industry's past. And there's a lot of directions that the series goes from that, central point as we explore what that means and how we can avoid repeating the history of, jobs and commerce, but followed by vacancy and pollution. And one thing that we found is that while taxpayers are, helping build this future for the industry, often with new plants on greenfields, across the state, we are also paying to clean up polluted and vacant sites left by the industry in the past. And there are some real questions around whether the policies that we have in place today are enough to keep us from repeating that history at this nexus where we see ourselves, where we know new plants are being built. There are also projections that Paula can probably speak to that other plants will close as those new plants are built. And if they have been around long enough, there's a good likelihood of contamination in some of the older automotive plants. So we are likely to be reckoning again with what to do with vacant, contaminated sites, even while our state is celebrating and navigating the jobs and build outs of the future.
Yeah, I think that's a great summation of what we found. And one of the things that we thought was important to put into the project also was just to look at solutions. We also found that there are some redevelopers out there who are tackling some of the most polluted properties out there. And while their risk is higher, their reward is higher also, but it also depends on a lot of public money as well, or at least some public financing through brownfield tax increment financing, which there is some debate about whether it's public money or not, because it does depend on the value of the property increasing and then the developer capturing some of that tax benefit or that tax gain. So while there's some question about whether that's actually public subsidy or not, it is happening out there to some degree. And the unknowns are just really kind of endless right now.
Thank you both so much. That really, it was a huge project, and being able to distill it like that, I think, can be really helpful for readers as an introduction to this discussion. So next, I'm just curious for a little peek behind the curtain. I've been at Bridge for a long time now, and I can't recall, at least not recently, a reporting project where we saw two sort of reporters who are on different beats collaborate on such a piece of enterprise journalism. So this project really brought together our environmental reporting with Kelly and our business reporting with Paula. How did that idea come about?
I think, oh, go ahead, Paula.
I was going to say, well, we were drinking beer one night after work. I think it was the first time we ever actually got together outside because of COVID. We hadn't really seen each other. And we started talking about things that we were both passionate about, and we realized there was a convergence. At that point, we didn't know it was the auto industry, but it was something that, that seed was planted, a year, 2 years before now, before we actually even started the work, I think.
Yeah, and I think it was, there's environmental reporting, and I'm sure you feel this way about business reporting, Paula. It touches so many other aspects of life, right? So to me, yes, we have different beats, but especially in an industrial state like Michigan, they intersect all the time. And I'm even remembering a staff meeting, like even earlier, when it was like we were brainstorming, big themes in Michigan that needed to be covered, and that really affect life in Michigan and don't necessarily get a lot of attention. And just the general concept of, legacy pollution and vacancies and its toll on communities came up. And it is such a natural fit, in my opinion, for business and environment expertise, because the vacancy and blight obviously has major economic and business implications for communities. And the ability to revitalize a community after the exit of a major employer is really complicated by the existence of contamination, in addition to, the health and environmental impacts that a community also faces by that contamination.
I'll say it too. It's also like really easy to look backwards. There's a track record that we can be looking at, but some of this, like where we could take this, also started to gel for me last spring when I ended up spending some time in the Big Rapids area, where Goshen at the time was fighting to get the rights and the state money to build a plant there, and there were a lot of questions about that, and some of them pointed to China, and I think that was what a lot of the public discourse was. But while I was on the ground there, a lot of people were asking questions about, like, what about the water? How do you make sure that it's okay? Because we don't understand what chemicals are coming into this building. And the answers I heard were, there are state regulations, or they'll have to follow all the state rules, but nobody really indicated that there were specific steps kind of plugged into the process. And that just kind of, I think, made me think about the past a little bit differently as we were writing it in the Big Rapids area at that time.
Really fascinating. Thank you for that background. Right now, obviously there's no way to have known this when you began planning this story a year ago, but the auto industry is certainly front and center in many of the daily headlines right now. Why is this an important story to tell right at this moment?
The auto industry is writing its future right now. It has been for the last couple of years, but things keep changing. We're seeing new subsidies, new federal mandates, new federal legislation, new federal money coming into the industry and supporting its direction towards EVs. And the automakers are making choices on the ground that are getting them to that point too. But there are so many roadblocks and so many kind of so many detours that they could be taking. I think the financials aren't supporting their move yet. So they're making like huge investments in things that'll be realized in the future. The outcome for them is really undetermined despite the goals that they say, but those decisions happening right now are shaping so much of how they will use land, how they will use people, and how they're deploying their funding.
Thank you, Paula. One of the stories that it seems to be really resonating with readers is about sort of the communities that you visited that have been really decimated by pollution and sort of the industrial legacy of the auto industry. I was really struck by the sort of visceral frustration felt by so many of those communities where automakers or auto suppliers had been a huge part of the local economy and then left them with empty factories, and oftentimes really kind of left them on their own to clean them up and try and sell them. So in defense of the auto industry, every building or factory does have an expiration date at some point. What was it about these examples that left local officials with such frustration?
I can start on that one and I think that goes back to also the moment in time. A lot of these investments are happening while communities are still sitting on vacant sites. In some cases that date back to, a couple decades when the industry had its last big transformation. And so I think that's where the frustration comes from. One of the communities we looked at is the Lansing area, where you've got 235 acres in the heart of a community whose economy was really built around General Motors for many generations, that were abandoned by the company during its bankruptcy. Taxpayers now are covering the cleanup there, and there is an effort that's been ongoing for a long time to clean up and redevelop them, but that's complicated by the existence of pollution that wasn't publicly known at the time of the closure. So it's gotten more expensive, more complex, and more than a decade since that cleanup began, it's still not clear what the future of these properties will be. Meanwhile, 7 miles down the road, GM and a partner, LG Energy Solution, are building their newest EV facility. So lots of complexity and lots of reasons that can be pointed to for why one site sits vacant and why another site is the way to go for that company in the future. But if you're sitting on the ground and you're a neighbor there and you're staring out at 235 acres that hasn't had much use for a long time now, there's definitely a sense of frustration. And I think we looked at several other communities across the state where they're not yet sure what to expect. Maybe they have more recent plant closures. They don't know if there's pollution, but they do know that they've lost jobs and tax revenue. And that question of, is it polluted, can be a huge one for communities as they try to plot their future. Is this going to be a site that can be put on the market sometime soon? Or is this going to be a site that we're going to learn has bigger problems that are going to complicate our future as a community? So, I think that sense of anxiety and uncertainty is really palpable in a lot of these former auto towns.
Yeah, those emotions, they kind of run the gamut. So like in Lansing Township, the officials there you know, they were so frustrated, and it went back decades before GM closed the plant that is in the township, or in Lansing and in Lansing Township. Company officials were coming to board meetings asking for tax breaks. It's like, so the community feels like they've never stopped giving to the corporate entity. You know, they gave up what they needed to keep them there, and it wasn't enough. And what they're left with is this, you know, all these years later. And I will, you know, well, Kelly talked to the folks in Milan, who I think have an amazing story to tell about wondering what could be coming to their factory, and then kind of learning almost by accident that there is some contamination there. And like in the case of Wyoming near Grand Rapids, I talked to officials there. They don't look back. They're very happy that they bought the property. They were finally able to sell it recently, but they're waiting for development. They wanted to take control, but it really came at a community cost. You know, the property is vacant. Everybody can see the vacancy. It's vacant for a purpose. And the tax rolls have been like taking care of it for many, many years. But they're still optimistic as they look forward. But it did come at a cost. Kelly, I don't know if you want to talk more about Milan, because I think that's extraordinary.
Yeah. And to preface that, this is not directly answering your question, Amber, but one thing that I think is a subtext in a lot of these conversations is, you know, Michigan has been having a conversation about Greenfields sprawl and our state's struggle to rein in sprawl and what that means for our ability to maintain, you know, more and more infrastructure with the same number of people. And again, all sorts of, you know, understandable reasons why new factories get built on greenfields. You know, automakers say they need more land. Old sites may not have other resources that they need. Paula's more of an expert on that than I am, which is why I'm not going in deep depth. But the optics, you know, can be really hard to stomach if you're a community that got that lost a facility that provided tens of thousands of jobs in some cases, lost the tax base as a result of that, lost residents as they left for new jobs elsewhere. All problems that are really caused by the exit of a major employer. And then you're seeing that same major employer build, sometimes just miles down the road. So that was definitely a frustration that I heard in the voice of Milan's mayor, Ed Kohler, who kind of hit his wit's end this summer. There's a former Ford Plastics facility there that has been closed for a number of years. But he said he started receiving calls from prospective land buyers saying, hey, I'm looking for 100 acres of industrial land. You know, do you have any? And he said, yeah, we have one that's been sitting vacant for quite a while. City doesn't own it and can't get a word out of Ford about its plans for the property. So he says that he set up a meeting with Ford to basically ask them to either sell the property or put it back to better use. It's being used as a warehouse right now. And the Ford officials used the word brownfield, which is a term for a contaminated site in Michigan. And he said that was the first time that he had any indication that the site might have contamination. But Ford officials kind of clammed up at that point. So we did some digging. It's not on the state's list of Part 201 list, which is kind of an overarching list of contaminated sites. But in pulling documents and talking with other parts of the state regulatory regime, we found that the site does indeed have contamination issues that Ford is now studying with state oversight. And they very well could complicate any effort to sell or reopen the plant. So, you know, there you have a community that's saying, geez, we have, you know, this hole in our tax base, we don't have jobs. We also have interest in our property, and we're seeing Ford build on a greenfield somewhere else. The frustration is there. Obviously, the answer is not so simple. You know, this was 100, I believe 100 acres, a relatively small factory. The new Ford facility is going to be much bigger. I don't think it could go in Milan, but the frustration is easy to understand if you're one of those communities that's dealing with the detritus of the very same industry.
Absolutely. Well, you've just touched on some of the issues that I want to ask about, but you might imagine when you first hear it that there would be a lot of excitement in places like Marshall or Delta Township or Big Rapids about getting a new EV battery factory that, at least on its proposal would create thousands of local jobs. And I'm sure that many in those communities are happy about that, about sort of that news or that announcement. So why, I'm curious, do you think there's been, the reaction has been more complicated? You've just touched on some of these issues, but if you could dig in a little more about why are communities having sort of a mixed reaction to some of these announcements of the EV battery production?
Part of it is the sheer size. These factories are enormous. They might be 1 million square feet. They might not be, but they're presented as absolutely enormous. I drove to Lordstown, Ohio, right after the GM Ultium announcement a couple of years ago, and I mean it's jaw-dropping what has been built there, and that was before there were other businesses built around it. I think that at the time I was there, they had just formalized an agreement with a recycler who was going to build a facility. So it's like they also generate related businesses around them. The sheer size is like I said, breathtaking, jaw-dropping. It's like when we're used to seeing factories, we're not used to seeing factories of that size. But some of it is also the transparency and the trust. They don't usually come up for public discussion until they're actually almost a done deal. And the done deal part of it is kind of furthered by seeming like a rubber stamp to a lot of the people who live in the communities where they're being located. The state is trying to assemble more mega sites right now. And I think there's a lot of skepticism and concern among communities that see like very large farm fields that might have a for sale sign there, and that they also could be targeted for a mega site.
And I'll just add, I think Paula sums up all of it, but just extremely briefly. She has far more experience in the scope of the mega sites. But I did talk with residents near the Lansing site of where there's a new Ultium battery factory going in. And I think the past contamination for some folks there very much colors their opinion about the future site there. So, one resident who lives across the street she's very concerned. And one of the first things she said to me when I was asking her, what her opinion is, she said, I grew up in Lansing and I watched GM pollute and then abandon the sites in Lansing. And how do I trust that they're going to be different here? We have different environmental laws than we did, when those factories were there. Many things are different, but I think for residents who live directly across the fence line, it's a valid question of how do you prove to me that things are different now?
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that I think about even in those situations is PFAS. So we have existing testing in wastewater, and unless you're looking for something, you don't know that it's there. So now we know how far the PFAS contamination has spread because of testing like 8 or 9 years ago that was just kind of checking it out. And so like if we don't have anything in place to actually check for what could be on the site, we'll never know.
Okay. Speaking of sort of the public cost of the state's industrial legacy, your reporting calculated at least $259 million in ongoing public costs from contaminated properties tied to the auto industry. Could you tell us a little bit about what it took to arrive at this number, and why do you say it's likely an extreme undercount?
Sure, and I can start in on that, and Paula just stopped me. But we spent, I don't know how many back and forth phone calls with the various public agencies that keep data on contaminated site. I don't know how many data requests and days spent digging up and creating our own data where there was a lack of data. So I think you said this, Amber, but it's important to note that 259 million is an extremely conservative number that should be read as a snapshot, and likely a small snapshot, not the universe of public cleanups. And it's for a couple of reasons. One, our cleanup laws are pretty opaque, and by and large, there are a lot of ways to avoid reporting legacy pollution to regulators in a way that would essentially add it to the list of 26,000 contaminated sites in the state, or how you plan to clean it up. So the state often learns of sites when someone volunteers the information. They don't have a way to be made aware of every contaminated site in the state. So the list itself is likely an undercount. And then once you go into the list, with 26,000 sites in Michigan, about half of which are considered orphans, where cleanup costs will fall to taxpayers, the state basically has not had the resources to keep up. So we know there's this huge public, pool of money yet to be spent. Only a fraction of that money has been spent so far, because to cleanups on many of these sites. So again, it's an undercount of an undercount. When you get into the few thousand sites where public money has been spent so far, in many cases, there's no information on who caused the pollution, what industry caused the pollution. The vast majority of them don't say. So what we did was, again, parsed it further. There were a subset that did identify some broad industry category responsible for pollution. We looked at the 4 categories that really couldn't include automotive. We weren't looking at, for instance, the dry cleaning category. And then it was a matter of literally pulling enforcement records, lawsuits, historical documents on individual sites to affirmatively say, okay, does this have an automotive industry link or does it not? Again, we were super conservative. There are landfills in the state that are polluted primarily with automotive waste. We didn't include them unless that was the sole source of waste and it was owned by that company. There were tons of suppliers that very likely had a connection to auto industry, but if we couldn't find historical documents that clearly said, here's how you're getting the majority of your business at the time that contamination occurred, we did not include them. So, then you're talking an undercount within an undercount within an undercount. And then, lastly, I'll just say, much of the cleanup cost in some cases doesn't end up on the public cleanup, these cleanup ledgers that we looked at. Because contaminated sites can take, as Paula mentioned earlier, yet more subsidies after they've been sort of cleaned up to a threshold where they're redevelopable. There might be a need for yet more subsidies to basically entice a developer to want to build on a tainted site. And I'll raise Flint as a really tangible example of that. So that is, again, a former Buick City, very large former GM automotive complex, was left heavily contaminated. The Racer Trust has been cleaning it up for quite some time now. Because of contamination that wasn't known when GM's bankruptcy happened, the money set aside for cleanup has not been enough, and they've had to draw from other pools and likely will continue to have to do so. 31 million has been spent on cleanup so far, with millions more to come. But on top of that, now it's being redeveloped, which is a real thing to celebrate for that community. But that has only been able to happen with, I'm going to get the numbers slightly off here probably, but I want to say about 15 million in state and local subsidies, plus a $72 million tax subsidy for the future, basically to offset the cost of removing concrete rubble that was left behind, building on a site that still needs environmental remediation. So, you get a $31 million cleanup cost if you just look at that ledger, but then it's a far greater cost beyond that to actually get that site somewhere where it can be reused again.
And cleanup, I find cleanup, I'm not up in environmental reporting all the time, but cleanup to me is interesting because in most cases we're talking about remediation and what makes it suitable for another use and what is the best use it can get to. So for most factories, from our experience, looking into this, you're looking at more industrial use or like a warehouse, because they're very rare situations where you could actually bring them up to standards of like what you would expect for residential housing or just some other type of use. And even talking about Flint, what was the best use for the former Chevy and the whole factory? A park, so nobody has to stir up the dirt there and do anything more in the future because it was so deeply contaminated.
Thank you for helping us understand sort of the scope. Another scope related question when it comes to sort of pollution. The story series notes that there are 26,000 known polluted properties in Michigan, and that the state's lenient pollution laws make it almost a certainty that there are many more that remain unknown to us. Why is it so hard to really nail down, get our hands around the scope of the problem? And solutions wise, how might the law be changed to hold industries more accountable?
So as I noted before, there's not a lot of transparency around where contaminated sites exist in our state. So I would say that's the number one reason. The state learns of these sites often. There are caveats all over the place in pretty much everything we reported on, but often when someone voluntarily discloses that information because they're buying a contaminated property and they don't want to be held responsible for the pollution that they didn't cause. That's voluntary, not everyone does it. And the other way it often happens is if pollution sort of migrates across the fence line and becomes publicly obvious. So you can think of instances where PFAS was found in Michigan rivers and regulators traced it upstream to a factory that was releasing it. Or the green ooze on the highway, that then led to a discovery of a plating operation that had deep contamination problems. So, there's just that lack of reporting that's needed for the state to, become aware of these sites. And then there's also a lack of money and staffing to investigate these sites and move forward on them. So at present rates of funding and staffing, the state is picking off a small percentage, like 2 to 3% of these sites, these orphan sites every year. And many of them take multiple years of attention. So if you're talking about how many are actually being, fully remediated, it's an even smaller percentage. And they have 43 fewer people dedicated to this cause today than they did back in the 90s when the known universe of contaminated sites was like 9 times smaller. So that's a part of it too. It's hard to get a handle on a growing problem when your lens into it is small and your resource to figure out more is small. As far as solutions, there's a huge debate in Michigan that's been going on for decades around liability for contaminated sites and who pays. That I think is separate to the question you asked about becoming aware of the existence of contaminated sites. But I just want to note that is a major ongoing debate in the state. But there are narrower changes being sort of floated right now with, it seems like at least some conceptual support from industry or willingness to have a conversation about it that would help the state at least get a better handle on what's out there. And that would include things like, mandatory reporting for pollution, which exists right now in many cases if you have like a spill, a major event where a certain amount of something is spilled. But what I heard from regulators and advocates is that oftentimes the threshold is far higher than what it would take to do long-term environmental damage. And then there's this huge other gray area where if it's legacy pollution and you find, let's say 1,000 gallons of something in your soil, you don't know where it came from, you didn't just have a spill, maybe it dripped from a leaky pipe over decades. Is that reportable? So I think, one thing that I've heard as a proposed solution is clearing up some of those gray areas and lowering the threshold for when you have to actually report to the state.
Thank you so much for that background. Kind of turning a little bit to the new development that's happening in the state. So after Michigan lost out on 2 huge Ford EV campuses a couple years ago to Tennessee and to Kentucky, there was some panic in Lansing that the industry was leaving the state. So Governor Whitmer teamed up with Republican leaders in the legislature to create this big project investment sort of pool of funds known as the SOAR Fund. It was designed to make sure Michigan would be able to compete for these future projects and react quickly. And now Ford and GM have 2 projects that are being constructed in the state. So why is there so much pushback to SOAR now, especially sort of bipartisan pushback? I imagine it's for many of the reasons we've talked about so far, but so like why is this all happening at this moment?
So, yeah, SOAR was highly celebrated, and it did assist Michigan in gaining some large projects. And economic developers still talk about it as a tool that they can use and want to still use. I think the pushback is coming from legislators on both sides of the aisle and a lot of the public raising questions about things like transparency, which we've talked about. Excuse me. But in the case of the legislature, they're also looking at the return on investment from the mega dollars too. What kind of jobs are being promised and how are we getting them? So like in the case of Ford, which just temporarily pulled the plug, we don't know if it's permanent, in Marshall, those jobs would pay just over $40,000 a year, which, for millions and millions, hundreds of millions, and ultimately an award worth at least $2.2 billion to the company, is that the job that we want to pour all of this money into? And also the money is changing. We've had access as a state to more money than ever, thanks to the pandemic and a lot of the funding, the stopgap funding that has been coming out of Washington. So kind of like looking to reposition how we use incentives just seems to be kind of converging along all of those paths. And it sounds like they are going to be initiating some reform legislation probably in the next few weeks. And this time, actually, they're looking at environmental criteria too. So another aspect of this is that jobs has been the criteria of success. We know how much the jobs pay, but that's not really weighted. What we do see is the volume of jobs measured as success. And now, one example that I heard was that possibly the state, in awarding an incentive, should be considering the environmental track record of a company who's applying for the incentive. What have they done? How have they shown on the ground that they're actual stewards of the property that they occupy?
Fascinating. Thank you. Speaking of the legislature, and I just have a couple more questions before I want to turn to some of these fantastic reader submitted questions. So Democrats are now in charge of both chambers of the state legislature. You just touched on this, Paula, but what is it specifically that they want to do alongside some Republicans to bring more accountability to industrial pollution laws and while retaining sort of our ability to attract business investment? And also, what are the chances of any such laws passing?
I can touch on the pollution. Oh, you want to go,
Sure.
Paula?
You go ahead.
I'll quickly touch on the pollution part. I feel like earlier we covered the concept of some sort of transparency requirements and reporting requirements. So that's something that we're definitely hearing is likely to be proposed this fall. And just to note, this is something that Wisconsin, our neighbor to the west, already does. Their spills law says if you have a spill, you have to report it. So it sounds like proponents of change are looking for something that's a little more full-throated. If you find legacy pollution, you have to report it. And there are more ways for the state to maintain oversight as opposed to having cleanups sort of happen in secret without the public being made aware. The big thing that I'm hearing some desire to change is this question of how do we clean up the contaminated sites that are already on the public docket? We've got these 13,000. The state has never been adequately equipped to keep up as more sites are added. So this backlog just keeps growing. And if your community is sitting on a contaminated site and there's no funding to remediate it, then that leaves you at a disadvantage in all sorts of ways, you know, especially in a moment where there's a lot of competition for new development and growth. And if you're sitting on a site that really can't compete because it's contaminated and there's no money to clean it up, it has real ripple effects. So two sort of possibilities there that I'm hearing floated are, one, the concept of fees on likely to pollute industries, which is something that has precedence. Our federal Superfund law is in part funded by such fees that then, you know, feed a kitty, which can be used for cleanups at orphan sites, or the concept of financial assurances, essentially deciding which industries you think are, you know, most likely to have contamination problems and or problems where they go bankrupt and the contamination is left to someone else, which we've had a huge problem with in our state. And saying, okay, you know, if you are engaging in this industry, you need to hold some sort of insurance policy to fund cleanup in the event that one is needed and you're not around here to do it. That also has precedent. Michigan and many other states require it for landfill owners, you know, to pay for ongoing stewardship of landfills after they are closed. And you're increasingly seeing some communities do that around big box stores, which have similar issues with, you know, vacancy and abandonment that then plagues communities after that tenant leaves.
So kind of on the, and perhaps in response to such policies that have been proposed, I'm curious to know sort of what is the business community and automaker reaction to these proposals so far? And do pro-business groups have a point in saying that any changes could potentially damage Michigan's ability to compete for such projects in the future?
As for the automakers, we don't know. They wouldn't talk to us. They do talk to me for certain types of stories, but just as an example, I've written about the closure of the Ford Romeo plant, which is, you know, had an appearance in this series. I have never received a reply from Ford over many questions that I've asked about their intention for the property. So we don't know on that front. The business groups that we talk to, they do seem open to at least discussing what's going on, you know, what could happen, what could improve things, or what might be proposed that would give them a heads up to come up with ways to work with it. I think their goal is to keep things predictable for their members. We're talking to a lot of umbrella organizations like the Michigan Chamber or Small Business Association of Michigan. Their members want predictability, and they don't want too much regulation that affects their operations from many sides. So we shall see. They also did not want to talk about it specifically because there are no specific plans proposed out there, although there are a lot of conversations going on in Lansing. So they wanted to be able to predict or to react to specifics, not just speak to what they would accept or what they would not accept.
Yeah, and I think that covers it, but I'll just say in addition to predictability, I think cost. You know, the question of how clean is clean enough is a big one in Michigan, because if you're asking more, it's going to cost more. I think one challenge for Michigan and many other states is that you are in competition with other states. So, you know, we hear all the time from industry, or when we're talking about, you know, the value of regulation or more regulation or less regulation, it is, you know, what's to stop someone from going to a state with lower standards if the standards here are raised. And I think that feeds into the incentive. Well, I don't think it does feed into the incentive conversation too. You're seeing bigger and bigger incentives because states are being pitted against each other to attract the investment.
Thank you both. I'm going to turn the page to some reader questions because we have a huge amount of them and I want to get through as many as possible. Thank you all for submitting some really excellent questions. We have some that came in through the chat and also some that were pre-submitted on our registration page. This is one that came in through the registration page. We've talked a lot today about sort of manufacturing centered on electric vehicles. Is that the future of manufacturing in Michigan? And if there are other industries, what sort of expansions to sort of our current manufacturing base do you foresee based on your reporting?
A stated goal of Michigan is to retain automotive manufacturing. So that is one of the reasons they're running so hard at EV jobs. And with the assumption that those will be the jobs of the future. Kind of unsaid is that the traditional jobs that are out there aren't going away yet, that there's going to be a slide, but the slope of that is undetermined at this point. So that is happening. And they hope that net-wise that auto manufacturing remains a big deal in Michigan. But I'm seeing a lot of other manufacturing try to close the gap or grow also. State officials talk to me about food and how that could be a big deal. Pharmaceuticals, we already have a lot going on here, and there's a sense that that could be expanded as well. I think those are probably two of the bigger ones. Semiconductors is a goal. We do have manufacturers here now and developers, and there's a sense that that could also expand.
Thanks, Paula. Another question that was submitted by a reader, they were curious about when you were doing research for this project, did you encounter any proposed solutions to finding more resources to clean up legacy sites in Michigan that did not impose liability on landowners and sort of preserve the successes of our brownfield redevelopment program? I think this sounds like someone who's thinking a little bit about sort of the person who owning the land kind of carrying some of the onus. Are there solutions out there that would avoid that?
Yeah, and I would say right now, at least from the lawmakers we talk to, I am not hearing an immediate appetite to change liability standards in Michigan. So, in the past, Michigan had what is called strict joint and several liability, where essentially anyone in the chain of command in a property could be held liable for cleanup. If you didn't think it was you, you needed to defend that stance. Now, sort of the script is flipped. You're presumed that you have not done it unless the state can say who did do it. That does not appear that it's likely to change this legislative session, at least from the folks we talk to, but there is still a ton of public debate about it. But the things that do sound like they're on the table that address contaminated sites without changing liability are those questions of when do you have to notify the state and the public that contamination exists? How clean is clean enough, and how often can site, responsible parties defer to capping pollution as opposed to removing it? And then what level of oversight does the state have, and how are we funding it? And I will just say, the arguments in favor of loosening liability were that by having lower cleanup thresholds, you make it easier for someone to clean up a site and put it back into use. I do want to, so in addition to those, changes that could be coming to our contamination cleanup laws, another idea is just putting more requirements in the incentives themselves. So we talked with a lot of experts for a solution story, and we did not. We've obtained, the contracts for some of these new sites that are going in, and there are not additional provisions around how these site owners are going to steward the site post-closure, making sure essentially that they don't become yet another vacant big site. And there is precedent for building more requirements other than jobs into these sort of big incentives programs. So that's another proposed solution that we heard.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of additional reader questions about possible solutions and sort of just wondering about the full scope of ways that we could deal with this problem. So this reader asked, besides reinstating polluter pay and retightening contamination standards, how do we reckon with the problems of forever pollutants like dioxins and PFAS, especially when it comes to groundwater? What's in place currently? Are there thoughts about doing more, especially as we learn, every year of more contaminated sites that exist?
I can touch real briefly. That was not a focus of our reporting on this series, so I won't go into extreme depth on it, but just from other environmental reporting, things I often hear from folks who, are looking for this same outcome are better regulating chemicals themselves, keeping things out of use that might lead to contamination problems down the road. There's a huge ongoing conversation right now about PFAS and which ones should be regulated and which aren't. Michigan has its standards. The feds have proposed standards around some PFAS compounds, but there's a lot of question around, which will or won't be regulated in the future. There are conversations, for instance, around banning the use of certain substances that have safer alternatives. So one thing I'll reference is a story we did for this series on the plating industry, metal plating, which often can be a source of contamination in Michigan. And in that space, there's been a campaign by environmental health groups to ban hexavalent chromium, which is a toxic chromium compound, in instances where it's not serving an essential purpose. Its purpose is more aesthetic, a really shiny grill. Because there are other metals, namely trivalent chromium, that don't have the same contamination risk, but can still be used to plate something. So those are two. A third one is I'm constantly hearing about just a need for better day-to-day oversight of industry to avoid a situation where a pollution problem goes unnoticed by both site owners and regulators, only to emerge as a problem down the road after it's left, the pipe and gone into the groundwater and soil.
And I'll just add that I think business itself is a little bit behind the curve in dealing with some of this. And just as an example is that we've known PFAS as a problem and a forever chemical for quite some time, but the development of non-fluorinated mist suppressants to be used in the plating industry really lags. I don't think it actually really came into any type of use until the last year or two, and I'm not sure how common it is. But that's just an example of how, the development of something like that could have been taking place years and years ago, and it could have been adopted industry-wide right now. And also just a little more glimpse into how the sausage was made. We actually were, I don't know if I should call us naive enough, Kelly, but we actually thought we'd be talking about all of these chemicals. We'd be talking about all of this contamination. And in honing in on the auto industry, we think we found something that was meaningful and important to Michigan now. But that's not to say that all of the other contamination out there from different industries isn't as important. It was just far too overwhelming for what we were trying to accomplish.
It's a sweeping project as it is, and I'm sure there is so much that I'm sure you all wanted to dive into, and Bridge will continue to cover. We only have time for perhaps one or two more questions, so I just want to try and get to a little bit more of the solutions oriented questions that we've been offered. So, the one group that we haven't talked about so far are the nonprofit organizations who work on environmental issues. So there are a lot of NGOs out there who are, the Sierra Club, MEC, lots of groups who work on these issues. Have they played a role in sort of either the development of the proposed changes to laws, and our brownfield redevelopment? Were they important sources to your stories at all?
Yes. No. Yeah, we talked with, as I think is always the case in journalism, we talked with many times more people than we actually have space to quote in any given story. And that goes from industry to advocates to academics to residents, you know, on all sides of these issues. But yeah, I would say, you know, the nonprofits, as I noted, there's one example is that there's a campaign afoot really spearheaded by the Ecology Center, which is a Michigan nonprofit, to convince automakers to stop demanding parts plated with hexavalent chromium when there are other options. You know, on both the business side and the environmental side, I would say that nonprofits play a big role in advocating for and against the various policies that we've noted in our series.
Thank you both. So I know that we're coming up against 1 o'clock. I want to give you a chance to tell us give you a chance for a final word. Is there anything that you want to make sure that readers check out? Are there any sort of concluding thoughts that you want to make sure that readers walk away with as we continue to grapple with this problem in Michigan?
Well, I will say I'm really grateful for all of the questions and all of the attention to this. I think it's gratifying to see that the work has either inspired or maybe fed some of your own curiosity or some of your own knowledge, of how Michigan deals with this. One problem that we encountered while reporting this, I'll just throw it out there, is that there wasn't a lot of information on a lot of the sites that go back years. For example, when I was digging into some of the closed factories from the 1970s and early 1980s, it was actually really hard to figure out where they were, what became of them, even what the address was, because they all had names, like internal names from the automakers. It's on my list to follow up on a few of these places and just try to see what happened to them since and whether they've been restored to active use in a community or not. But if you know of any properties out there that might have been former factories that you're not quite sure what happened to them, or you want to put them in front of us for some further work, I'd be totally into learning more and discussing it with you.
Yeah, I would echo that. We're going to be continuing coverage on this topic. And if you have opinions or story ideas to share or just thoughts about our coverage so far, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. The other thought that just popped up is you were saying, do you have closing thoughts? I think I am grateful that we were given time to pursue this reporting track, because sometimes it feels like in Michigan, you mentioned these problems with legacy pollution, and it's kind of well, duh, we're a manufacturing state, we're so used to this as part of our reality. It's kind of like that piece of art on your wall that you don't really even notice anymore. But it has huge implications for our state in terms of where we're able to spend public dollars, how can communities that are, stuck with blight can re-envision their future and what our options are. So I hope that the series was able to bring that home and make it relevant, in a state where sometimes it can feel irrelevant because it is such a persistent and commonplace problem.
Thank you both so much. And thank you to all of you who participated in today's discussion. I know there were a handful, maybe even a dozen questions that we just didn't get to today. So if you have continued questions, as Kelly and Paula mentioned, or tips or anything that you'd like to follow up on when it comes to this story, please feel free to email those to me or to Kelly or Paula directly, and we'll make sure that we get them to them so they can continue to sort of follow these issues and report on them. Thank you again for sharing your lunch hour with us today. I have learned a lot from this series, and it seems as though many of you have as well. Thank you again to Paul and Kelly for being our panelists for today's discussion, and my colleague Jackie for introducing us and running the technology today. Thank you to all of you for being here and for participating. If you know anyone who might have enjoyed this conversation but wasn't able to join us, please feel free to share the recording. We will be posting it on Bridge's website as well as our social media channels later on this week. We will also be resuming our lunch break series in about a month. So keep your eyes open to Bridge's website and your newsletters for an announcement of the topic as well as the date and time for our next lunch break event. Thank you all so much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and we'll talk to you again soon. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.